The silence in our house had developed a texture. It was no longer a mere absence of sound, but a physical presence, a thick, suffocating felt that muffled everything. It was particularly dense at the dinner table, a space that was once the bustling heart of our shared life. Tonight, I had cooked a perfect medium-rare steak, seared with a rosemary-crusted char, accompanied by asparagus roasted until just tender. It was Amelia's favorite, or at least, it used to be. She offered no comment, her attention a fractured thing, divided between the food she mechanically moved around her plate and the small, malevolent rectangle of glass resting beside it. Her phone, a constant third party in our marriage, lit up with the ghost light of notifications she no longer bothered to hide. I watched her from across the vast, polished expanse of our dining table, a geographer studying a newly alien landscape. Her face, a map I once knew by heart, was now a territory of distant expressions and unfocused gazes. This detachment was not new. It had been her prevailing climate for months, but tonight, it was charged with something else. An electrical hum of intent. She was a storm cell, gathering energy, waiting for the precise moment to discharge. And then, she did. I don't regret spending the night with Richard. The words were not shouted. They were not whispered in guilt. They were spoken with the calm, deliberate precision of a surgeon making an incision. She did not look at me. Her eyes were fixed on the deep crimson of the wine she swirled in her glass, a small, controlled whirlpool in the palm of her hand. For a single, suspended beat of time, the statement was just a collection of sounds, meaningless syllables hanging in the air. Then, they coalesced into meaning, and the meaning plunged into me, a shard of ice pressed against my spine. My fork, halfway to my mouth, I set down with exaggerated slowness. The clink of silver on porcelain was a gunshot in the crushing silence. The room seemed to contract, the walls drawing closer, the air thinning. I held my own features in a state of rigid neutrality, a mask I had perfected over years of corporate negotiations, even as the ground beneath me felt like it was tilting on its axis. What did you just say? My voice was a low murmur, a conversational query. I would not give her the satisfaction of a tremor, of a crack in the veneer. Her gaze finally lifted from her wine, and she met my eyes. A smirk, so faint it was barely perceptible, played at the corner of her mouth. It was the smirk of someone who believes they have just played a winning card, a final, unanswerable move. You heard me. That smirk. It was a declaration of war disguised as a minor victory. It turned my stomach, a slow, acidic churn of something far colder and more potent than simple anger. I raised my own glass, taking a deliberate sip of wine, letting the silence stretch and coil between us. I could feel her watching me, waiting, expecting the explosion, the accusations, the tears. I gave her nothing. I leaned back in my chair, cradling the bowl of the glass in my hands, as if she had just offered an opinion on the weather. How very bold of you, I said, my voice as even as a placid lake. Was it worth it? If she was surprised by my lack of reaction, she hit it well. The smirk deepened, gaining confidence. Yes, she said, her tone dripping with a defiant satisfaction that was almost rehearsed. Richard knows how to make a person feel alive. It's a feeling I haven't had in years. Ah, there it was. The justification, neatly packaged as an indictment of me. The classic maneuver, turned betrayal into a critique of the betrayed. I had anticipated it, of course, but the clinical expectation of a blow does not lessen its impact when it lands. I nodded slowly, taking another measured sip of wine, letting her words settle not into my heart, but into a cold, analytical corner of my mind. Good to know, I said at last, setting the glass down with a soft, definitive click. I'm glad he could provide you with that experience. She blinked. Just once, a flicker of confusion that momentarily disturbed her composed expression. This was not the scene she had written in her head. That's all you have to say? For now, I replied, my eyes locking with hers. But don't worry. By morning, I'm sure you'll have plenty to regret. The smirk faltered. For a fraction of a second, a shadow of uncertainty crossed her face, but she quickly papered over it with her cultivated bravado. You're always so measured, Liam. So composed. It's exhausting. Maybe that's why Richard is so refreshing. He isn't afraid of a little passion. Passion, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air, heavy and soiled. Is that what you're calling it? Or was it just poor judgment wrapped in a cheap thrill? Her jaw tightened, the first visible crack in her armor. Good. She was not as untouchable as she believed. The remainder of the meal was a masterclass in silent warfare. I finished my steak, each methodical slice of the knife a small act of defiance. I would not allow her to see the tempest she had unleashed within me. She, on the other hand, merely pushed the cooling food around her plate, her initial confidence visibly eroding with each passing, silent minute. Her grand confession had not detonated our lives as she had expected. It had simply fizzled, leaving behind an awkward, toxic residue. When the pretense of eating was finally over, she seemed desperate to escape. "I'm going to bed," she announced, her voice abrupt. She grabbed her phone and fled upstairs without a backward glance. I remained in the kitchen. I poured another glass of wine, the deep red a perfect mirror of the cold fire in my veins, and leaned against the granite countertop. The conversation replayed in my mind, not as a source of pain, but as a piece of intelligence. She thought she had seized power, that her confession was an act of liberation. She was a fool. She had mistaken my composure for weakness, my patience for complacency. She had forgotten who she married. As I drained the last of my wine, a blueprint began to form in the quiet architecture of my mind. It was intricate, multi-layered, and utterly ruthless. Amelia might not regret her actions now, in the flush of her manufactured passion, but regret was coming for her. It would become her shadow, a constant companion in the new, desolate world she had just chosen. And Richard would learn that some men's lives have foundations you do not touch. He would learn that crossing me was not just a mistake. It was a terminal diagnosis. With a steady hand, I rinsed my glass and set it in the sink. Tomorrow, the work would begin. But tonight, I allowed the profound silence of the house to settle around me. It was the calm before the storm I was about to become. The morning dawned with the same unnatural quiet that had concluded the night. Amelia was gone before I rose, a phantom who had left behind only the ghost of her expensive perfume and a single, untouched cup of coffee on the counter, a monument to our failed domesticity. I stood before it for a long moment, the steam rising like a departing soul. Her words from the night before were an insidious echo, a loop of sound playing in the theater of my mind. I don't regret it. A fresh current of anger, hot and sharp, coursed through me. I let it surge, then methodically tamped it down, compressing it into a dense, cold fuel. Anger was a blunt instrument. What this situation required was a scalpel. Amelia had thrown a grenade into the center of our lives, expecting chaos. She would get none. She would get precision. My first task was to conduct a post-mortem on my own blindness. The signs, in retrospect, were a constellation of cliches, so obvious I felt a fool for having dismissed them. The late nights attributed to project deadlines. The sudden, last-minute business trips. The subtle but significant upgrade in her wardrobe. The sharper cuts, the more expensive fabrics. The meticulous reapplication of makeup before leaving the office, not before coming home. I had rationalized it all as ambition. She was driven, a shark in the corporate waters, and I had mistaken her predatory preparations for professional dedication. And then there was Richard. The name itself was a bitter pill on my tongue. I had never met the man, but I knew his type. He was a brand, not a person. Amelia had curated my image of him through a series of carefully dropped anecdotes, always tinged with a breathless admiration I had mistaken for professional respect. "He's brilliant," she'd once said, a faint, private smile playing on her lips. "He just has this way of commanding a room." She had been an evangelist for his cult of personality, and I had been a willfully deaf member of the congregation. The day passed in a fugue state of calculated restraint. I moved through my routine, a perfect automaton of normalcy. But beneath the surface, my mind was a whirring engine of strategy. Amelia believed she had caught me off guard. She could not comprehend that her confession was not an end, but a beginning. It was the starting pistol for a race she didn't even know she was running. That evening, I decided to test the integrity of her lies. When she arrived home, she was a study in distraction, her phone a constant, buzzing appendage. She placed it face down on the counter, a gesture of feigned discretion, but not before I saw his name flash across the screen. "How was work?" I asked, my tone light, anodyne, as I set the table. Fine, she replied, the word clipped and defensive. Busy. Anything interesting happen? I pressed gently, sliding a plate of pasta before her. A flicker of hesitation. Her eyes darted to the dark mirror of her phone. Nothing worth mentioning. I nodded, taking my seat. Must be exhausting, working so closely with someone like Richard. He seems intense. Her fork stopped midair. Her eyes, sharp and suspicious, snapped to mine. What do you mean? Just an observation, I said with a shrug, taking a sip of water. From what you've said, he seems to demand a lot from his team. Some of the tension left her shoulders. A misdirection, successfully deployed. He does. He expects excellence. It's a lot of pressure. I offered a faint, conspiratorial smile. Sounds like he keeps you on your toes. Her expression shifted, an almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes. I saw it. Guilt. Anxiety. A cocktail of emotions that told me I was on the right path. After dinner, she retreated to the living room, her phone once again her primary companion. I remained in the kitchen under the pretense of cleaning, observing her from my periphery. The soft smiles that touched her lips as she stared at the screen. The rapid, fluid dance of her thumbs across the keyboard. It was an intimate ballet performed for another man, in my home. A profound, simmering rage began to build inside me. Not just at her, but at myself. How had I been so complacent? How had I allowed the foundations of my own house to rot from within? But self-recrimination was a luxury I could not afford. It was a useless, indulgent emotion. If Amelia and Richard wanted to play a game, I would meet them on the board. But I would not be playing by their rules. I would learn their rules, their strategies, their every weakness. I would map out their entire world of secrets and lies. And when the time was right, I would burn that world to the ground. For now, I maintained the facade. She believed she was the one in control, the one who held all the cards. The truth was, I had already begun to quietly, methodically, unravel the entire tapestry of her betrayal. And soon, very soon, she would feel the first thread pull taut around her neck. My inquiry into Richard Bowman began not as an act of a wounded husband, but as a corporate deep dive. I treated him as I would a hostile takeover target, a subject to be dissected, analyzed, and ultimately dismantled. Emotion was a liability. Information was ammunition. The public-facing Richard was a masterpiece of corporate branding. He was the charismatic CEO, the visionary leader whose razor-sharp wit and polished charm were legendary. He didn't just run meetings, he held court. He didn't just close deals, he orchestrated victories. This was the man Amelia had sold to me, and to herself. But I wasn't interested in the glossy pages of the brochure. I was looking for the fine print, the footnotes, the redacted sections. I was looking for the rot beneath the varnish. The first fissure appeared, as it often does, through the informal channels of gossip. My sister, Clara, a senior partner at a law firm, had an ear permanently tuned to the frequency of corporate intrigue. When I mentioned Richard's name over lunch, her expression soured. Richard Bowman, she mused, her brow furrowed. The human supernova at Omnicorp. I've heard things. Rumors, mostly. Let's just say his ascent has left a trail of scorched earth. Go on. I urged, my tone neutral. A friend of mine, a very sharp woman, worked under him at his last company. She said he's a professional parasite. He identifies rising stars, mostly ambitious women, and latches on. He becomes their champion, their mentor, their confidant. He dangles promotions, promises them the world. And once they've served their purpose, or become inconvenient, he cuts them loose and rewrites the narrative to make them look incompetent or unstable. It was a chilling confirmation of my nascent theory. Richard wasn't just an adulterer. He was a predator who used the architecture of corporate power as his hunting ground. My next call was to Ethan, an old friend who specialized in corporate compliance and digital forensics. He was a ghost in the machine, a man who could navigate the labyrinth of data trails without leaving footprints. When I asked him to run a background analysis on Richard, he didn't ask why. He just asked for the name. A few days later, he called back. His voice was grim. You were right to be suspicious. This guy's got a history of skating on thin ice. 3 companies in the last decade. At each one, there's a pattern, a sudden departure preceded by a flurry of internal complaints. Harassment, hostile work environment, you name it. They were all quietly settled, buried under the weight of NDAs. More interestingly, there was an informal SEC inquiry into some suspiciously timed stock trades at his first CEO gig. Nothing ever stuck, but where there's that much smoke, there's a fire. I finished for him. Anything on his current situation? He's good at covering his tracks, Ethan admitted. But men like him, men who believe they're infallible, they always get arrogant. They always leave a loose thread. Keep digging. I was beginning to see the full picture. Richard's seduction of Amelia wasn't just a personal conquest. It was a strategic investment. Through a few carefully orchestrated, seemingly innocent conversations with a former colleague of hers, I learned the specifics. Amelia was spearheading the Phoenix Project, a high-stakes, high-risk initiative that had the potential to either secure Omnicorp's market dominance for the next decade or bankrupt the company. Richard hadn't just seduced my wife. He had co-opted the leader of his most critical project. The next time Amelia mentioned him, I was ready. Richard has been so supportive through all this pressure, she said one evening, a defensive edge to her voice. He really believes in this project. He believes in me. I had to physically restrain myself from scoffing. Of course, he believes in you, I thought. Asterisk, you're his human shield. His potential scapegoat. His golden ticket. Asterisk, she wasn't his partner. She was his asset. Dazzled by the blinding light of his charm, she couldn't see the strings attached to her wrists, the very strings he was using to make her dance. It was a rage of a different kind that filled me then. It was no longer just the anger of a betrayed husband. It was the fury of watching someone I once loved, a brilliant and capable woman, allow herself to be so thoroughly played. I knew then that a simple confrontation would be insufficient. To merely expose the affair would be to play his game, to reduce this to a tawdry domestic drama. No, I had to expose the man himself. I had to pull down the entire scaffolding of his carefully constructed life. To do that, I needed more than rumors and settled complaints. I needed a witness. I needed a survivor. Richard Bowman may have thought he was untouchable, but he had made one fatal miscalculation. He had chosen my wife, and in doing so, he had made an enemy of me. I would not just fight back. I would systematically deconstruct his entire existence. And when I was done, there would be nothing left but the truth. The first signs of Amelia's disillusionment were subtle, like hairline fractures in a porcelain doll. Her confidence, once a formidable fortress, began to show signs of siege. She had built her professional identity on a foundation of competence and control, but that foundation was now being systematically undermined by the very man she had elevated to the status of a god. From my detached vantage point, I watched the drama unfold. I didn't need to pry. The evidence presented itself in her weary posture as she walked through the door at night, in the forced brightness of her smile, in the way she flinched whenever her work phone buzzed with an email from him. The frequent, adoring mentions of Richard's name had ceased entirely. In their place was a brittle, defensive silence. I already knew why. My network of allies kept me informed. The Phoenix Project was beginning to falter. Unrealistic deadlines, shifting goalposts, and a lack of promised resources were creating a perfect storm of failure. And Richard, true to form, was masterfully positioning himself outside the blast radius. What was once his unwavering support for Amelia had curdled into public criticism. In team meetings, he would dissect her decisions with surgical cruelty, framing her careful strategies as indecisiveness, her calculated risks as recklessness. He was humiliating her by 1,000 small cuts, all while maintaining the outward appearance of a concerned leader pushing his team to greatness. One evening, she came home looking hollowed out. She poured a large glass of wine and sank onto the sofa, the silence around her a palpable entity. I observed her for a moment before speaking. "Tough day?" I asked, my tone deliberately neutral. She exhaled a long, ragged breath. "You could say that. Richard giving you a hard time?" I pressed, carefully, like testing a weak spot in the ice. Her head snapped up, her eyes flashing with a defensive fire. "Why would you say that?" I shrugged. "Just a hunch. You're the project lead. The pressure must be immense. It's a make-or-break situation for him, too." Her jaw clenched, and she looked away, back into the depths of her wine glass. "It's nothing I can't handle." I let the subject drop, but her reaction was a confession. The pedestal she had built for Richard was crumbling, and she was trapped in the debris, unable to reconcile the savior she had imagined with the saboteur he had become. What she didn't know was that Richard's cruelty was not just a reaction to the project's troubles. It was a proactive strategy. Lila, who had continued her charade of friendship with him, had delivered the final, damning piece of intel. Richard was already grooming Amelia's replacement. A younger, more pliable associate, hungry for opportunity and blissfully unaware that she was being positioned to take the credit if the project succeeded, or to be discarded alongside Amelia if it failed. It was his signature move. Amelia had served her purpose as his lover and his project lead, and now, he was preparing to write her out of the script. The temptation to confront Amelia with this truth, to throw her own poor judgment in her face, was immense. "This is the man you chose," I wanted to scream. "This is the passion you threw our life away for." But I held back. She was not ready. A cornered animal will only fight harder. She had to arrive at the truth on her own terms. My role was not to push her, but to gently illuminate the path. So I waited. I watched as the cracks widened. I saw the way her hand trembled as she scrolled through her emails, the dread that settled on her features when his name appeared on her screen. The once thrilling urgency of his attention had become a source of constant, low-grade terror. One night, I found her at the kitchen table, her laptop open, staring blankly at a spreadsheet that seemed to mock her with its complexity. I leaned against the doorframe. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," I said softly. She didn't look up. "It's just work. It'll pass." "Will it?" I asked, my voice quiet but pointed. "Or is this what happens when you tie your entire world to someone who only cares about himself?" Her fingers froze on the keyboard. The silence that followed was heavy with everything she couldn't bring herself to say. I saw the battle raging within her. The pride that kept her from admitting her mistake, and the dawning horror that she had sacrificed everything for a lie. She shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of denial, and returned to her typing, shutting me out. I walked away. The truth was a rising tide, and she was standing on the shore, pretending the water wasn't already swirling around her ankles. Richard's mask was not just slipping. He was tearing it off himself, and soon, Amelia would have no choice but to see the monster underneath. When that day came, I would be ready. The unraveling was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. Patience is a form of power. While Amelia was drowning in the immediate crisis of her own making, I was playing a long game. The web I was weaving around Richard was intricate, its threads spun from data, testimony, and his own monumental arrogance. Lila was my most valuable asset, a quiet operative deep in enemy territory. She met with Richard under the guise of seeking mentorship, playing the part of a sycophantic admirer. His ego, a vast and fragile thing, made him careless. Over espressos and expensive lunches, he would pontificate about his corporate philosophy, unknowingly providing a running commentary on his own sociopathy. "He's already chosen Amelia's replacement," Lila reported to me one evening, her voice a low, disgusted murmur over the phone. "A new hire named Chloe. Young, brilliant, and completely starstruck. He talks about grooming her for leadership. He actually used that word. It's sickening. He's setting Amelia up to take the entire fall for the Phoenix Project." The news solidified my resolve. This was no longer just about vengeance. It was about preventing him from destroying another career, another life. Meanwhile, Ethan was my digital archaeologist, unearthing the skeletons Richard had tried to bury. He discovered a pattern of questionable vendor contracts at Omnicorp, all awarded to shell companies with indirect links back to a private equity firm Richard had connections to. It was a subtle form of kickback, a sophisticated grift that enriched him while putting the company at risk. "He's good. I'll give him that," Ethan said during one of our encrypted calls. "The paper trail is a maze. But he's not perfect. There's enough here to trigger a full-blown forensic audit if it gets into the right hands at the right time." The final, crucial piece fell into place through Clara. An old colleague of hers had worked with Richard years ago and had mentioned a woman named Hannah, a rising executive whose career had been mysteriously derailed shortly after working closely with him. It took Clara weeks of delicate networking, but she finally made contact. I met Hannah in a sterile, anonymous hotel lobby bar. She was poised, her gaze direct and unflinching, but I could see the old scars behind her eyes. Her story was a chilling blueprint of what was happening to Amelia. The intense mentorship, the manufactured intimacy, the promises of a brilliant future, followed by a sudden, brutal severing of ties and a whisper campaign that painted her as unstable and unreliable. "He isolates you," Hannah said, her voice steady. "He makes you believe you're the only one who truly understands his genius, his vision. By the time you realize you're just a tool he plans to discard, he's already poisoned the well. Everyone you might turn to already believes his version of the story." She looked at me, a flicker of something like kinship in her eyes. "Men like him don't stop. They just find new victims. If you have a chance to stop him, you take it." Her words were a mandate. With Ethan's financial data, Lila's insider knowledge, and Hannah's powerful testimony, I had a complete arsenal. The plan began to crystallize. It would not be a quiet takedown. It needed to be public. It needed to be definitive. At home, Amelia was a ghost haunting the rooms of our life. She was losing the battle at work, and she knew it. The late nights were no longer filled with the thrill of ambition, but with the desperate, frantic energy of someone trying to plug the holes in a sinking ship. One evening, I found her on the sofa, staring blankly at her laptop, the screen filled with an intimidating project timeline glowing with red alerts. I walked into the room and leaned against the doorframe. "You look tired," I said. She glanced up, her eyes hollow. "The project is complicated." I nodded slowly. "You know," I began, my voice casual. "The thing about men like Richard is that their loyalty is never to a person or a project. It's only ever to themselves. When things get complicated, they don't look for solutions. They look for scapegoats." Her head snapped up, her expression a volatile mix of panic and defiance. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Just an observation," I said with a shrug, turning to leave. "Good night, Amelia." As I walked away, I felt her stare burning into my back. The threads were tightening. She was beginning to understand that the game she had chosen to play had rules she never knew existed, and a price she was only now beginning to calculate. The web was nearly complete. All that was left was to invite the fly to the parlor. The night of the Omnicorp annual gala was a symphony of manufactured elegance. Crystal, chrome, and forced smiles glittered under the warm, forgiving light of a dozen chandeliers. It was the perfect stage for the final act of Richard Bowman's tragedy. I had spent weeks in the shadows, orchestrating this moment, and yet, as I adjusted my tie in the mirror, I felt a profound and unsettling calm. This was not a passion play. It was a demolition. Amelia and I arrived as a united front, a convincing performance of the power couple we had once been. She was breathtaking in a gown of midnight blue, a porcelain mask of poise hiding the cracks of her anxiety. She knew something was wrong, not just with the project, not just with Richard, but with the very air she was breathing. But she couldn't yet identify the source of the poison. Richard was in his element, the sun around which the corporate planets revolved. He stood near the center of the grand ballroom, a champagne flute in one hand, gesturing with the other, his laughter booming with the unshakable confidence of a king in his court. He was utterly oblivious. My allies were already in motion. Ethan had, through a discreet third party, delivered a plain manila envelope to the personal assistant of Omnicorp's chairman of the board earlier that day. It contained a neatly organized dossier, the shell company contracts, the buried HR complaints, a summary of the SEC inquiry. A ticking bomb. Clara was gliding through the crowd, a social shark in her own right, subtly seeding conversations with questions about Richard's past leadership roles, planting the first seeds of doubt. And Lila was at Richard's side, playing her part to perfection, her soft laughter and rapt attention, keeping his ego inflated and his guard completely down. Hannah arrived last, a quiet specter of judgment in a simple, elegant dress. She slipped into the room, took a glass of water from a passing waiter, and found a discreet position near the edge of the room. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, an exchange of understanding. She was ready. The evening progressed through its predictable rituals: dinner, clinking glasses, a series of self-congratulatory speeches. Amelia was a statue of tension beside me, her gaze darting constantly towards Richard. The moment finally came. Richard took the stage to a round of enthusiastic applause to deliver the keynote address and announce the imminent success of the Phoenix Project. He began his speech, his voice resonant with practiced charisma. He spoke of vision, of innovation, of the bold future he was building. And then, it started. A single phone screen lighting up in the audience. A whispered question between two board members. A hushed conversation at a nearby table. The information in the dossier was beginning to circulate, a digital contagion spreading through the room. Richard, a master at reading a room, felt the shift. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. His confident cadence faltered for a half-beat. The whispers grew louder. And then Hannah stood up. "I'd like to say something," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and steady, and it sliced through the growing murmur, instantly silencing the room. Richard froze, his hand tightening on the lectern. Every eye in the ballroom turned to Hannah as she stepped forward into the aisle. "You speak of vision and leadership, Mr. Bowman," she began, her gaze locked on his. "But your true talent lies in manipulation. You build your success on the work of others, and then you discard them. You use people, you ruin reputations, and you rewrite history to protect yourself. I know, because I was one of them." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Richard opened his mouth, but before he could form a denial, Clara's voice cut through the air. "And she's not the only one." She held up her phone, the screen displaying the first page of the dossier. "For those of you who haven't seen it yet, I suggest you review the documentation on Mr. Bowman's financial misconduct, his history of unethical practices, and his pattern of emotional and professional abuse. It's all there." The floodgates burst. The room erupted not in shouts, but in a lethal cascade of quiet, urgent conversations. Board members were conferring, executives were staring at their phones with expressions of horror, and Richard's allies were visibly distancing themselves from him. He stood on the stage, a statue in the glare of the spotlight, his carefully constructed world dissolving into chaos around him. He tried to speak, to regain control, but his voice was lost in the rising tide of his own ruin. Amelia was rigid beside me, her face a mask of pale disbelief. She turned to me, her voice a ragged whisper. "Did you?" I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. He did this to himself. Richard stumbled from the stage and fled the ballroom, his departure punctuated by a deafening, judgmental silence. The gala would continue, but its purpose had irrevocably changed. It was no longer a celebration of success. It was the wake for Richard Bowman's career. On the drive home, Amelia said nothing. She stared out the window at the blurred city lights, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. The silence was absolute. She had witnessed the public execution of the man she had betrayed me for. By morning, she would have to confront the woman who had made it all possible, herself. The quiet of the next morning was different. It was not the tense, angry quiet of the weeks past, but the hollow, echoing quiet of a bombed-out city after the raid is over. I rose first, the events of the gala replaying in my mind with the cool detachment of a film critic. Richard's empire had crumbled. The mission was complete, but there was no sense of triumph, only a vast, empty landscape where my marriage used to be. I found Amelia at the kitchen table, a sentry guarding a cup of coffee she had no intention of drinking. She was still in her silk robe, a relic from a life that no longer existed. She looked up when I entered, and for the first time, I saw no defiance in her eyes. Only a profound, bottomless exhaustion. I poured my own coffee and sat opposite her. The silence was hers to break. Finally, her voice, small and raspy, emerged. "Did you know?" "All of it." "Did I know what?" I asked, my tone neutral. "About Richard, the other women, the money, everything that came out last night." I took a slow sip of coffee. "I knew enough," I said. "The signs were there, Amelia. You just had to be willing to look." Her face crumpled. A single, perfect tear traced a path down her cheek. How could I have been so stupid? So blind? I leaned back, observing her. The question was not for me, but for herself. "Because you didn't want to see," I stated, not as an accusation, but as a diagnosis. "You wanted to believe he was your savior. You needed him to be. It was easier than looking at what was broken in here." I tapped my own chest lightly. "In us." She flinched, then let out a bitter, self-deprecating laugh. "You must hate me." I considered the word. Hate. It was too hot, too passionate. What I felt was colder, more complex. "What I think," I said slowly, "is that you made a series of catastrophic choices. And now, you are living with the consequences." Her gaze snapped to mine. "My career is over. My reputation is destroyed. I've lost everything. Everything. I repeated, raising an eyebrow. Is that what you think you lost? A career? A reputation? I leaned forward, my voice dropping, the composure finally giving way to a shard of the ice-cold fury I had kept locked away. You didn't lose everything, Amelia. You took what we had, our trust, our history, our future, and you willingly, consciously, gave it away for a cheap counterfeit. Don't you dare confuse the consequences of your own actions with victimhood. Her lips parted, a protest forming, but no words came out. The truth of my statement was absolute, undeniable. She looked away, her hands clenching on the table. For a moment, she seemed to shrink, to be consumed by her own shame. Then, she took a deep breath. She straightened her spine. The woman who had built a career on resilience, the woman I had almost forgotten existed, flickered back to life. You're right, she said, her voice quiet but steady. I did this. I let him into my head, and I let him convince me that his world was better than ours. I was wrong. I'm not going to let him be the end of my story. There it was. Not an excuse. Not a deflection. Accountability. It was the first honest thing she had said in months. I hope you mean that, I said, standing to leave. Because rebuilding what you've shattered won't happen overnight. If it happens at all. As I walked away, I felt a sliver of something that wasn't anger or satisfaction. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was simply possibility. Over the next few days, the fallout was swift. Richard was fired, his name now a corporate cautionary tale. Amelia, true to her word, resigned, severing the last tie to the man who had nearly destroyed her. At home, we began the slow, arduous process of sorting through the wreckage. There were no grand apologies, no dramatic scenes of forgiveness. There were only small, tentative gestures, a shared, quiet dinner, a question about my day that seemed genuine. They were not enough to rebuild a house, but they were, perhaps, enough to clear the rubble and see if any part of the foundation remained. It would have to be enough for now. In the weeks that followed, our house became a monastery of quiet reflection. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape scoured clean. Amelia began the painstaking work of rebuilding not her career, but herself. It was a process I observed from a careful, self-imposed distance. She started therapy, as she had promised. She would return from her sessions looking emotionally sandblasted, her eyes raw but her posture a little straighter each time. She took up journaling, filling notebooks with a furious script, as if trying to excavate the poison from her own soul. She did not ask for my pity or my absolution. She simply did the work. I, in turn, began to process the full scope of the wound. The anger, once a roaring furnace, had cooled into something more manageable, a low, pilot light of caution. I could not forget, but I had to decide if I was capable of forgiving. The question was a constant, low hum in the back of my mind. One evening, I found her in the living room, surrounded by her journals. She broke the silence that had become our native language. I talked about you in therapy today, she said, her voice soft. I looked up from my book, waiting. My therapist asked me why I did it. Why I threw away something real for something so obviously fake. And I finally had an answer. She looked down at her hands. It wasn't about Richard. It was never about him. It was about me. I felt stagnant, invisible. And instead of talking to you, instead of working on myself, I looked for the easiest, most destructive shortcut to feeling something new. Her words were unvarnished, stripped of excuse. They were the sound of someone finally taking ownership. And what about us? I asked, the question hanging between us, heavy with the weight of our shared history. She finally met my eyes, and they were filled with a profound, aching sorrow. You were the constant, Liam, the steady hand, and I treated your consistency like a cage instead of an anchor. I took you for granted because it was easier than admitting I was the one who was adrift. I know that now, and I hate that it took a shipwreck to make me appreciate the shore. Her voice cracked, and she swiped angrily at a tear. A long silence followed. I weighed her words against the mountain of my own pain. I don't know if I can get back to what we were, I said, the truth of it a heavy stone in my gut. I don't want to go back, she replied instantly, her voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. What we were was broken, or this never would have happened. I want to build something better, something honest. That single word, *honest*, struck me with more force than any apology. It was an acknowledgement of our shared failure, a recognition that the fault lines had existed long before Richard ever appeared. Our healing was not a single event, but a slow, geological process. There were still tremors of resentment, nights where the ghost of her betrayal sat between us in bed. But there were also moments of unexpected grace. A shared laugh over a forgotten memory. A quiet walk where our hands brushed. A tentative question about the future. We were not the same people who had sat at that dinner table months ago. I was less trusting, perhaps, but more aware. She was scarred, humbled, but also, paradoxically, stronger. We were two survivors, standing in the ruins of a life, considering the daunting task of building anew. It was not a guarantee of a future, but for the first time in a very long time, it felt like a beginning.